Okay, so yesterday we saw how to hash a particular password, how to do the registration and how to store that registration data. And particularly for the security purposes that we understood that we should not store the plain password as is. So we have to basically encrypt it in some way that nobody understands, nobody will be able to decrypt. Right. So that is why we used a certain hashing algorithm. So in order to hash, we have used a library called, what is the library we used for password hashing?
Bcrypt, sir.
Right? Bcrypt is the one. So we have to, I mean, going further, right? So wherever the company, software companies that you join, so if you are asked to build application from scratch, you have to ensure that the passwords are hashed properly, and you can use Bcrypt for hashing. Okay. Right.
Okay, sir.
So today we'll try to understand for before authentication, we'll try to understand what is the session and the session management. Hold on a second. I think OneNote is closed. Let me open the OneNote. Okay. So we saw the registration. We were able to store that information in the DB yesterday. Now today we'll proceed further. Okay. So this is your browser. This is your web application, and this is your DB. DB is where you have stored your user information. So from here, user enters the username, password, and clicks on submit. And then that request would reach to your web server, and you would have written certain handler function which has a query to interact with the DB. It gets the password, and we again hash that password and input password, and we compare it with the DB password. If they are equal, which means it is a valid user. If not, it is a invalid password. Okay, so and then you return that response based on whether it is valid. If it is invalid, you will return the same response to back to the browser stating it's an invalid response. Okay, if it is a valid, then you will probably navigate to the home page. Right. So thereafter, so let us say you have you can navigate from slash home is your home page. Then you will have slash profile. Let us say slash posts. Okay, these are the different URLs that you want to access. Now, what happens? So by default, you will land up at slash login. Slash login. So where you enter your username password. Let us say you entered a valid username password, and then it would let you into, it will redirect you to the home page. If it is an invalid password, obviously will still stay back in the login page itself. Okay. Now what happens? Now when I go to the slash home, that it should know. Now the server should basically know that this user, whoever is coming, is a valid, already authenticated user. This user is already authenticated user. If I go to a slash profile or slash post, it should know that, okay, this user is an authenticated user. Then how would a browser know that you are an authenticated user already? So how would your application know, web application know? Right. So with the moment I hit facebook.com, basically I have not been authenticated. So it is asking for me to authenticate. So I have to provide my email ID or phone number. And then if I enter password and the moment I click on login, it would basically logs me in. Right. So once we log in, so the first page that we see is that home page where you see the list of posts, the friends, the chat and everything. And from there you can go to individual post. You can click on a photo. You can click on chat. You can go to the chat. Then you can go to your profile. There are so many URLs that you can go through. Now, what is the if every time you pass through a particular URL, does Facebook ask for a username password every time? Right, it does know that this is a valid user because you have already provided your credentials once, which is your email and password. Now, after every request, right, there should be some way to identify this is a valid user. There should be some way to identify this is a valid user. So what we do, right, after the successful login, we will from the server we will generate something called session. Okay, we'll generate something called session, and we will generate a particular session ID. Okay, and this ID, right, will be valid for certain. You can set a expiry on it, basically 1 day, 1 hour, 2 days, 3 days, 4 days, how many ever days, right? You can set a expiry on this particular ID that you generate. Now what we will do, and we will, this is the server side generated session, and I will, on the successful response, right, I will send that session ID, okay, and store it onto browser, and store it onto browser. In browsers, there is a concept called cookies. In browser, there is a concept called cookies. What does cookies means? Cookies generally mean a biscuit, right? Yes or no?
Yes, sir.
Right, so generally means that, so we eat that to, like, survive. In the same way, browser needs a certain information to store, so on a browser we need a place to store certain information, so that the browser can use that information to send it to the server, server. So what it does is, generally cookies meaning it is something that browser consumes. It is something that the browser consumes. Now what happens is that on this particular facebook.com, okay, I am storing a particular cookie. I'm storing a particular cookie, which is session ID. Okay, SSID, session ID, you can call it whatever you want. People call it different thing, but in general, it is called session ID. Now, for this session, the moment user logs in, server generates a session and puts it onto the browser. Okay, in the response after the authentication, it sends that session ID, and that session ID will be set as a cookie in the browser, as a cookie in the browser. Now, thereafter, whenever we send a home request, I'm sending my session ID. Okay. As access profile, I send my SSID because that is there in browser. Browser by default sends this cookie on every request, sends this cookie on every request. Okay. Now, based on this cookie, right, browser knows, right, browser knows that, sorry, your web server knows that this is a valid. Web server takes that session ID, and even web server will have a tiny cache where it knows that, okay, this session ID is it, what is the expiry time of it, right? It is, let's say, 1 day. And if the same with the same session ID, if you go back after 1 day, it will automatically log you out, right? But within 1 day, how many ever time you access, as far as the session is valid, your browser lets you, sorry, your web server lets you pass through. Your web server lets you pass through. And once we identify that as invalid or expired, or you explicitly click on a logout, right? We have to remove the session ID from the browser cookie. That way, on every request, it will not send that session ID, and hence this is identified as a unauthorized request, and we will always navigate the user back to login page. Right, that is how generally authentication works on an overall. Right, that is how in general authentication works. Okay. Right. So yesterday we saw that how to hash a password and all. Right. Let's continue further. User registration is done. Now today I'll just create another directory, call it a user login. Okay. So for Flask, okay, let me just create one apply file app.py, right? One template, and let me just add this. Let me create another folder, call it templates. In that, let me create one file called login.html. Okay. All right. So I'm just creating a form. So I'm just creating a input tag, right? ID I'm going to take email and type is equal to email. And I'm going to say name is equal to email and I'm going to say required. Then and label. Password. Password. Okay, and at the last, what do we need? Submit button. Okay, so I'm going to save this. My login page is ready. Now let me go back to this. From Flask, import Flask app is equal to Flask. I can give whatever name. Generally, I used to take __ name. If __ name is equal to so my app is also ready, but I have to define a particular route. Login. Okay, and methods is equal to, by default we'll have only get, but still I'm going to write get and post. Right. After this, def login. Right. If I want to check what is the method type, I would need a request object. For request object, I have to import the request. Request dot method equals to get. Right. Return.
Yes, sir.
In order to render template, I have to use render template. Yeah. I'm going to just return render template and I'm going to just say login.html. If it is a post, we will try to see what to else it is a post. Okay, now for now, I'm just going to say pass and let us see if the get is working. So here. Let me try running app.py. Let me go back to the browser. Just say localhost / login. Is it working? Yes, it is asking for email. It is asking for password. And then you have a login button. Right. So we have pretty much this. Yeah. So you can enter whatever the username passwords that we have given. So what did we give yesterday? So we have only one user. So let me do one thing. So let me also take the registration into this piece of code. Where is registration? Going to put this guy here. So I got the dbcon and schema also here. From the app, I'm going to take this create user to these two routes as well. And I have to import bcrypt. Okay, done. So I have to import pgcon also. From okay, so the existing code seems fine. I have to import redirect. So that way, yeah. So we are good. So let me just stop and rerun. Okay, for the form, let us look at the login form. Did I mention the type and action? Nothing I have mentioned, right? Login method is equal to post. You have to mention, otherwise it will assume that as a get, and it does a get. It does put it as a query parameters. Okay, login and method post. Was there anything else that was required? Method post and ID. ID can be ignored. That is fine. Was everything. Okay, right. Seems good. Okay, so this basically supports how many things now? So it does support register as well. And let us try to register the user. So password, I'm giving something, right? Let us go validate. Did we get that user now? Right? Did we get that the user?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. All right. Now let us try to log in. Let us try to log in. So as I was saying earlier, so in order to log in, so we would need help of a particular library. So which library? So for doing the hashing, we took help of the bcrypt library. Now here we will be using a library called Flask login. Library called Flask login. So let us install that. Pip freeze. I'll just do just to show what is there so far. Right. So we have, like, so many things: Jinja, psycobj2, binary, bcrypt, right? Flask and its related dependent libraries. Now we will install Flask login. Okay, so successfully installed Flask login. So in order to manage our login or authentication, so we will be using Flask login library. Flask login library. Okay. Right, let's get back to the code. So let me just start the server again. Right, we did install Flask login. Flask login that will help us to manage our authentication. Now, so basically, I already have the users in the DB, which is Srikanth and Momin, and there is a particular email ID and there is a respective password both of us have entered. Okay. Now, when we try to authenticate, it should basically check for the email ID and check for the password. And if they are valid, only then it should allow the user to log in. Only then it should allow the user to log in. Okay, so that is the idea. Okay, all right. So first thing is we have to take the form data that will be inputted from the front end. So I am going to take email is equal to request dot form, right, email. And in the same way, I'm going to take password. Right. So first thing I have to check, is this a valid user? Is this a valid user? So in order to do that, is it a valid email ID? Is it a valid user? So Flask login has a particular session called login manager, particular thing called login manager. There's a class called login manager. So let's try to initialize that login manager class from the Flask login application. Login manager is equal to Flask login manager. So for that, let us import the from Flask login, right? Import login manager, import login manager. And this will take the Flask instance as a parameter, Flask instance as a parameter. So I'm passing app as a parameter to this. Okay, right. So this is our login manager. Okay, and now the login manager, right? So this will help. This will basically manage all the sessions for us. We don't have to do anything. So this login manager will manage the login, logout, and the session management for us. So we just have to use a few more things to set our Flask login working properly, to get the Flask login to work properly. Right. So one is the first step is to import login manager and instantiate the login manager by passing the Flask application as a parameter. First step done. Now, once that is done, we also Flask login also has something called user mixin. User mixin. So we have to create a new class. We have to create a class that basically inherits from the user mixin, So that class basically, like, just talk to the DB, get that user data, right? So for example, how does that class look like? Class user inherits from user mixin, So it will have a constructor. Right, basically I'll just say ID and I'll just that self.id is equal to ID. Okay. And after that, it should have a static method. So basically it should just say def get is these are some like predefined names that you should consider. So this will take the user ID and returns the user object Right. So this, right. So here we are going to set. Here we are going to call the DB by passing the user ID and get that particular user information. So I'm going to write my SQL query. Select star from profile where ID is equal to percentage yes. Right. So again, same here. Get the connection object first.
Okay, sir.
pgcon dot get DB connection. So you will get the connection. Right. Then after that, cursor is equal to connection dot cursor object you will take cursor dot execute. You will say execute query, comma pass the tuple by giving the user ID as a parameter. Okay. Done. And cursor dot fetch one. Right. So you will get one result set. After getting that result set, if rs, right, you might get that ID or you might not. Right. If rs return. So let us do one thing. So let me also add email ID and password as well into this. Or else let me just return a very basic thing. So return rs, nothing much here. None. Okay, done. Okay. Right. So this is what our get function looks like. So simple. Right. You need to have a class in order to manage your login. You need to have a class called user, which basically inherits from Flask login user mixin class, right? And it needs to have a small init function, so it just has an ID. And we said say get user ID, which basically fires a query to the DB, gets that particular data and sends it back to whoever is called. Now, who will call this function? Now, who will call this function? So we have created an instance, right, for login manager, right? So login manager will have you can use that. Hold on a second. So after this user class, right, you need to define a user loader function. Def load user, and this will take the user ID. This will take the user ID, right? And this returns user classes get function that we just defined, right? Just define user classes get function, right? Which is this. The static method, I can call it without instantiating it. But how would Flask by default calls this? How would Flask by default calls this? So we have to add @ login manager dot user loader. So we are explicitly saying login manager that if you want to load user, just use this function, and this function calls the get method of the user mixin. Okay, right. So these are the fundamental things that we have to do. Okay, now let us try to log in. So this would not take the ID. Let me just pass the email for it. Just forgive me. So let me pass email because ID I would not know, right? Where email is equal to whatever is passed from the front end. Okay, this email might be valid or invalid. Done. Okay. All right. And I have said load user. Let me call it as user email everywhere. Done. From here, what I got is email and password. So what I'm going to do here and the login. So if it is a post, I'm going to say user is equal to user dot get, and I'm going to pass my email. Yep. After that, we are going to say if user, if it is a valid email ID, it would return the data, right? Then in that case, I have to match the password. And in that case, I have to match the password. User dot. Let me print user first. See if we are able to get the user. If we are able to get the user. Else print user. And for now, every time I'm going to redirect to the login page itself. Okay, so let's not use the password yet. Register is done. Login, let us say. Let me add one more thing in the HTML. In the login.html. Let me add a div. Let me add a tag. Okay, so if you just reload this, why is it not coming? And let's save. Okay, since HTML change. Okay, didn't we start it with the debug true? Looks like I did not add the debug true. That's why it is not picking up the changes. So for development, you always use the debug true. So that way it detects the changes and then applies them automatically. Okay, so what does it say? Don't have an account? Sign up here. So the moment I click here, oh, I have given /login only here. It should go to /register. In the register, what will I say? Account. Okay, now see here. So we just added a href. We just connected both of them. So this says don't have an account, sign up here. And this goes to register page. And here already have an account, log in here. This goes back to login page. That way we connected two URLs. We connected two URLs, two paths. Are we clear?
Okay, sir.
Okay, using a simple
Yes,
a
sir.
tag here. It's a HTML thing. I just added a href. So this a tag, basically it's called an anchor tag, which navigates user from one path to another path, one URL to another URL, from one website to another website. Okay, a tag can do that. Okay, so this is basically if you already have an account, sign up here. Don't have an account, sign up here. Already have an account, then why? Go back and log in here. Okay, all right, let us try to log in. Okay, so let me just say okay, so this is basically I try to log in. So what does the error message should here? It says invalid user because there is no email. There is no user with that email ID. Yes, because there is no user with that email ID and it is saying invalid user. If I just say right, it says it's a valid user. So right, we are getting that DB record.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Right, so we are saying user.get. So it goes to user class. And in the get, we are passing the email ID and we are saying select star from user profile where email ID is equal to this. And we are taking the PG connection, getting the record and returning the respective value. And here in the login also, we are doing the same thing for user. Now, once the email ID is valid, password is equal to, what is the index of the password? Right? User -1 can I take? It's the last value anyways. Right? This is my password from the DB. Stored password. This is the stored password, which is already right. Input password is this. Now I have to check if this is valid. So which function basically helps me to validate? Bcrypt dot check password. So I have to pass stored password, comma, entered password. And for entered password also, what should I do? So we have to convert it to the respective bcrypt hashing thing. So this check password will take care of it. So we don't have to worry. So let me just say, if this is valid, let us print valid user. Else I'm going to say invalid user or invalid username or password. Okay, so all right, let me enter. I'm entering some random password, which is not the valid thing. Strings must be encoded before. Okay, so this input password should be encoded to 8, and this password also should be encoded to UTF-8. Only then this will work. Invalid salt. What happened? I do have the salt. Bcrypt check password should have worked.